Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Jean Piaget, the meticulous observer of the developing mind. Together and apart, they trace the unfolding of human consciousness from its earliest stirrings to its fullest expression, though they walked different paths to reach their understanding. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of human development. One seeing the soul's journey through symbolic landscapes and archetypal encounters, the other discovering the mind's construction through logical structures and adaptive intelligence. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Piaget, as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the gentle darkness of your rest, picture two men separated by language, by geography, by the very nature of their questions, yet bound together by a common wonder at how consciousness emerges from the formless depths of infancy into the complex cathedral of adult thought. One man, Carl Jung, gazed into the mythic foundations of the psyche, seeing in every dream and symbol the eternal patterns that have guided humanity since time immemorial. The other, Jean Piaget, watched children with the patience of a naturalist, observing how small hands reach for objects, how young minds gradually construct the very notion of permanence, causality, and self. Both were witnesses to transformation. Both understood that consciousness is not a gift delivered whole, but rather something that unfolds, stage by stage, crisis by crisis, integration by integration. Jung, born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, grew up in a world thick with religious contemplation and psychological mystery. His father was a pastor, his mother prone to strange moods and visitations from what she called her other personality. The young Carl absorbed the tension between Protestant doctrine and the numinous experiences that seemed to slip through the cracks of theological certainty. He was a child who experienced visions, who felt the presence of something older and deeper than the Christianity preached from pulpits. In his autobiography, Jung would later describe a pivotal childhood memory, a vision of God destroying Basel Cathedral with divine excrement. This shocking image, unbidden and terrifying, taught him early that the psyche contains forces that transcend social propriety and conscious intention. It was his first encounter with what he would later term the autonomous complexes of the unconscious. Jung's journey into psychology was not straightforward. He studied medicine, drawn to psychiatry partly because it was undervalued by his peers, partly because it promised to address the mysteries that had haunted his childhood. At the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, under the guidance of Eugen Bleuler, Jung encountered the shattered minds of schizophrenic patients. Where others saw only pathology and deterioration, Jung perceived meaning and symbol. The seemingly random utterances of a psychotic woman pointing at the sun and describing its phallus producing the wind became, for Jung, evidence of archetypal imagery that the patient had never consciously learned. These experiences convinced him that the psyche extends far beyond personal experience, reaching down into collective, mythic substrata. His collaboration and eventual rupture with Sigmund Freud between 1907 and 1913 forced Jung to confront his own psychological depths. The break was more than professional disagreement. It was a crisis of identity and meaning. Following the split, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner turmoil during which he deliberately engaged with his own visions and fantasies. He painted, he sculpted, he recorded dreams and active imaginations. From this darkness emerged his core insights: the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process of individuation. Jung came to see human psychological development not as a steady accumulation of rational capacities, but as a dramatic journey through symbolic landscapes, a hero's quest within the psyche itself. By the time Piaget was beginning his own intellectual journey, Jung had already established himself as a major figure in depth psychology. Piaget was born in 1896 in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, making him 21 years younger than Jung. While they shared Swiss origins and a profound interest in how consciousness develops, their temperaments and approaches could hardly have been more different. Piaget's childhood revealed an early gift for careful observation and systematic classification. At the age of 10, he published a one-page note on an albino sparrow he had observed in a park. This precocious publication marked the beginning of a lifelong commitment to scientific precision and empirical investigation. Where Jung's formative experiences involved visions, religious turmoil, and engagement with the irrational, Piaget's early years were dominated by systematic study of the natural world. He became an expert on mollusks, publishing extensively on their classification and adaptation. This early immersion in biology would profoundly shape his psychological theories. For Piaget, the mind was fundamentally an adaptive organ, no different in principle from the digestive system or the eye. Just as organisms adapt to their physical environment through evolution, minds adapt to their cognitive environment through the development of increasingly sophisticated mental structures. This biological foundation gave Piaget's work a materialist solidity that Jung's mystically tinged theories often lacked. Piaget's transition from biology to psychology came through philosophy, particularly through his reading of Henri Bergson and his grappling with the relationship between knowledge and reality. He became fascinated by what he called genetic epistemology, the study of how knowledge comes into being. How do we come to know what we know? How does the infant, who begins with no apparent understanding of objects, space, or causality, eventually develop into an adult capable of abstract reasoning and scientific thought? These questions drew Piaget toward the study of children, not because he had a particular affection for childhood, but because children represented natural experiments in the construction of knowledge. In 1920, Piaget began working at the Binet Laboratory in Paris, helping to standardize intelligence tests. It was here that his genius manifested. Where others focused on whether children answered questions correctly, Piaget became fascinated by the patterns in their wrong answers. He noticed that children of similar ages made similar types of errors, suggesting that they were not simply ignorant of correct answers, but rather operating with qualitatively different logical structures than older children and adults. A young child who says there are more coins when they are spread out than when they are close together is not being careless. They are revealing something profound about how their mind organizes experience. They have not yet constructed the concept of conservation, the understanding that quantity remains constant despite transformations in appearance. This insight became the foundation of Piaget's entire system. Development, he realized, proceeds through distinct stages, each characterized by its own logic and limitations. The sensory-motor stage of infancy, where the child learns through direct physical interaction with the world. The pre-operational stage of early childhood, where symbolic thought emerges but remains bound by perceptual appearances. The concrete operational stage, where logical thought develops but remains tied to tangible objects. And finally, the formal operational stage of adolescence, where abstract reasoning and hypothetical thinking become possible. Each stage builds upon the previous one through processes Piaget called assimilation and accommodation. The child assimilates new experiences into existing mental schemas, and when those schemas prove inadequate, accommodates by modifying or creating new schemas. Now, you might wonder, as you sink deeper into the comfort of your bed, whether Jung and Piaget ever met, whether they ever sat across from each other in one of those Swiss cafes and debated their differing visions of human development. The historical record suggests they had minimal direct contact. They moved in different intellectual circles. Jung was embedded in psychiatry and depth psychology, surrounded by analysts exploring dreams, myths, and the irrational. Piaget was part of the academic psychology establishment, eventually founding the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva, surrounded by researchers conducting experiments on children's reasoning. Yet they inhabited the same small country, spoke overlapping languages, and both achieved international prominence in understanding human consciousness. Their lack of sustained dialogue is itself revealing, a symptom of the growing divide in 20th century psychology between those who studied the rational mind and those who explored the irrational soul. Despite their different paths, both men were responding to similar cultural and intellectual conditions. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a crisis in Western understanding of human nature. Darwin's evolutionary theory had undermined traditional religious certainty about humanity's special creation. Nietzsche had proclaimed the death of God. The First World War had shattered faith in inevitable progress and rational civilization. In this context, both Jung and Piaget can be understood as attempting to rebuild a foundation for understanding human consciousness, though they chose very different materials for their reconstruction. Jung responded to this crisis by reaching backward and downward into myth, symbol, and the ancient patterns of human meaning-making. If God was dead in the traditional sense, Jung suggested the archetypes remained alive in the collective unconscious, continuing to provide structure and meaning to human experience. The psyche, in Jung's vision, was not a blank slate or a mere product of environment and conditioning. It carried within it the accumulated wisdom and pattern of human experience across millennia. The journey of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated self, was simultaneously a journey backward to these primordial patterns and forward to their conscious integration. Jung's approach was essentially conservative in the deepest sense. It sought to conserve and reconnect with dimensions of human experience that modernity threatened to forget or dismiss. Piaget responded to the same cultural crisis with a very different strategy. Rather than reaching backward, he looked forward and outward, toward a scientific understanding of how rational thought emerges from biological processes. His approach was progressive, confident that careful, empirical study could reveal universal patterns of cognitive development. If traditional authorities could no longer be trusted, Piaget's work suggested that careful observation and logical analysis could establish new certainties. His vision was fundamentally optimistic about the power of reason and science to understand even reason and science themselves. The child constructing knowledge through interaction with the world became, in Piaget's hands, a model for how humanity as a whole might construct reliable knowledge through empirical investigation. The cultural context of Switzerland itself deserves attention as we drift deeper into this comparison. Switzerland, neutral in both world wars, provided a protected space where intellectual work could continue relatively undisturbed. Yet it was also a meeting point, a crossroads where different European traditions intersected. German philosophy and psychiatry, French rationalism and experimental psychology, Italian humanism all flowed through Swiss universities and clinics. Jung and Piaget each absorbed these influences differently. Jung drawn more toward German romanticism and philosophical idealism, Piaget more aligned with French positivism and biological materialism. Yet both exemplified a certain Swiss quality, a tendency towards systematic thinking, careful observation, and a resistance to ideological extremes. As the 19th, 20s, and 30s unfolded, both men were establishing their mature theoretical systems. Jung, having emerged from his confrontation with the unconscious, was articulating his theory of psychological types, developing his understanding of the archetypes, and beginning his extensive studies of alchemy, mythology, and world religions. His method was hermeneutic, interpretive, seeking meaning rather than mechanism. He worked primarily with adult patients, many of them in midlife crisis, searching for renewed meaning and purpose. His therapy was conversational, imaginative, encouraging patients to engage with their dreams and fantasies as messages from the deeper self. Piaget, during these same decades, was conducting painstaking experiments with children. Often, his own 3 children served as primary subjects. He would present them with carefully designed tasks and observe their responses, seeking to map the precise contours of cognitive development. His method was empirical, quantitative where possible, seeking to establish universal patterns that transcended culture and individual variation. He viewed dreams not as profound communications from the unconscious, but as cognitive play, the mind practicing and consolidating schemes during sleep. Where Jung saw every symbol as potentially significant, Piaget tended to see cognitive operations as significant, with content being secondary to structure. Their different research subjects reveal much about their diverging paths. Jung worked with adults whose consciousness was already formed but troubled, fragmented, or seeking deeper integration. He encountered the psyche in crisis and transformation. Piaget worked with children whose consciousness was still forming, observing the gradual construction of logical thought. He encountered the psyche in original development. This difference in subject matter was not merely practical but philosophical. Jung believed that understanding the adult's psyche required understanding its archetypal foundations, the timeless patterns that structure experience. Piaget believed that understanding adult cognition required understanding its developmental origins, the biological and environmental interactions that construct thought. Consider how differently they approach the question of what is innate versus what is learned. For Jung, certain patterns were innately given, not as specific content but as formal possibilities. The archetype of the mother, for instance, was not a memory of an actual mother or an idea learned from culture, but rather an inherited readiness to recognize and respond to mothering figures in particular ways. The collective unconscious contained, in Jung's provocative phrasing, the deposit of all human experience right back to its remotest beginnings. This was not a Lamarckian claim that acquired characteristics could be inherited, but rather a suggestion that the human psyche has structure, that we are born with psychological predispositions shaped by evolutionary history. Piaget took a middle path between nativism and empiricism. He rejected the idea that knowledge was simply imprinted on a passive mind by experience, the blank slate view. But he equally rejected the notion that knowledge was innate, waiting to unfold like a genetic program. Instead, Piaget proposed that what is innate is a set of functional invariants, basic processes like assimilation and accommodation, along with certain reflexes present at birth. Knowledge itself, including fundamental concepts like object permanence, causality, and conservation, must be actively constructed by the child through interaction with the environment. The infant does not innately know that objects continue to exist when out of sight. This understanding develops gradually during the sensory-motor period, as the child acts upon objects and observes the results. Their different positions on innateness reflect deeper philosophical commitments. Jung's psychology was ultimately teleological, oriented toward purpose and meaning. The archetypes guide development toward wholeness and individuation. The symbols that emerge in dreams and active imagination are not random, but meaningful, directing the individual toward psychological balance and integration. The psyche is self-regulating, possessing an inherent wisdom that transcends the ego's limited perspective. This teleological vision gave Jung's work a spiritual dimension that many found compelling, though others criticized it as unscientific. Piaget's psychology was mechanistic and constructivist, oriented toward describing how mental structures are built through equilibration. When a child encounters experiences that cannot be assimilated into existing schemas, disequilibrium results, motivating accommodation and the construction of new schemas. Development proceeds through this dialectic of assimilation and accommodation, moving toward increasingly stable and comprehensive structures. There is no inherent telos, no goal beyond increasingly effective adaptation. Formal operational thought is not more meaningful than concrete operational thought, merely more powerful and flexible in certain contexts. Piaget deliberately avoided teleological language, seeing development as a natural process of organization and adaptation rather than a journey toward predetermined ends. Yet beneath these differences lay certain shared assumptions that connected Jung and Piaget despite their divergent vocabularies. Both believed in stages of development, though they conceived. These stages vary differently. Both saw development as an active process of organization and integration rather than passive reception of information. Both understood that earlier stages must be built upon rather than simply abandoned. Both recognized that development involves qualitative transformations, not merely quantitative increases in knowledge or complexity. And both believed their insights revealed something universal about human psychology, though they located this universality in different domains. Let your breathing slow as we turn now to examine more closely how each man understood the stages through which human consciousness passes. This is the heart of their implicit dialogue, the place where their theories run parallel yet never quite meet. Like railroad tracks extending toward a horizon neither quite reaches. Jung's conception of developmental stages was never as systematically articulated as Piaget's, yet it permeates his entire psychology. The process of individuation, The central concern of Jungian analysis is inherently developmental. It begins with the differentiation of consciousness from the unconscious, the establishment of an ego that can stand apart from its instinctual and archetypal foundations. The first half of life, roughly from birth through young adulthood, is devoted to ego formation, establishing oneself in the outer world, developing a persona that can function effectively in society. During this period, much of the psyche remains unconscious, projected onto others, or simply unrecognized. The crisis typically comes at midlife, what Jung observed in so many of his patients who seemed successful by external measures, yet felt hollow and lost. This crisis marks the beginning of the second half of life, a period devoted to integrating what has been neglected or repressed. The shadow, those aspects of ourselves we deny or reject, must be acknowledged and integrated. The anima or animus, the contrasexual elements in each psyche, must be recognized and related to consciously. Beneath these personal confrontations lies the deeper encounter with the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends and encompasses the ego. Individuation is the process of becoming consciously related to this self, not by absorbing it into ego consciousness, which would be inflation, but by establishing a right relationship between ego and self. Jung mapped this journey through various symbols and patterns he observed across cultures. The hero's journey, familiar from countless myths, mirrors the ego's development and struggle for independence. The Night Sea journey, descent into the underworld, or confrontation with the dragon represents the necessary encounter with the unconscious. The sacred marriage, or conjunctio, represents the integration of opposites. The mandala, that fourfold symbol of wholeness Jung found in his own art and in traditions worldwide, represents the achieved or approaching realization of the self. These were not merely metaphors for Jung, but autonomous psychological realities, patterns through which the psyche actualizes its potential. Crucially, Jung's developmental vision was not complete until death. The confrontation with mortality, the preparation for death, was the final stage of individuation. Jung's interest in the symbols surrounding death in various cultures stemmed from his conviction that the psyche prepares for this ultimate transition just as it prepared for birth and all the transformations of life. The symbols of rebirth, transcendence, and continuity that arise near the end of life were, for Jung, meaningful anticipations, not mere consolations. The psyche, in this view, has wisdom about its own trajectory that extends beyond the ego's comprehension. Piaget's stages were more sharply delineated and empirically grounded, focusing on cognitive rather than symbolic development. The sensory-motor stage, from birth to approximately 2 years, is characterized by the gradual coordination of sensory experience with motor activity. The infant begins with simple reflexes and gradually constructs increasingly complex schemas through repeated interaction with objects. A pivotal achievement of this stage is object permanence, the understanding that objects continue to exist independently of one's perception of them. The infant who searches for a hidden toy has achieved a cognitive milestone, constructing the very concept of a stable, external reality. The pre-operational stage, from approximately 2 to 7 years, witnesses the emergence of symbolic thought. The child can now use words and images to represent objects and experiences, enabling language and pretend play. Yet thought remains intuitive and perception-bound. The famous conservation experiments reveal this clearly, show a pre-operational child two identical glasses with equal amounts of water, then pour one into a taller, thinner glass. The child will typically say the taller glass now contains more water, unable to conserve quantity across transformations in appearance. Thought is centered on the child's own perspective, lacking the reversibility and logical operations that characterize later stages. The concrete operational stage, from approximately 7 to 11 years, marks the emergence of logical thought, but thought that remains tied to concrete objects and situations. The child can now conserve quantity, understand reversibility, and classify objects according to multiple dimensions. Yet, abstract, hypothetical reasoning remains difficult. Ask a concrete operational child to reason about impossible situations or purely abstract relations, and they struggle. Their logic works beautifully with the tangible but falters with the hypothetical. Finally, the formal operational stage, emerging around 11 or 12 and continuing through adolescence, brings the capacity for abstract thought, hypothetical reasoning, and systematic experimentation. The adolescent can reason about possibilities as easily as actualities, can generate and test hypotheses, can think about their own thinking. This metacognitive capacity, this ability to reflect on thought itself, represents for Piaget the culmination of cognitive development, though he recognized that not all adults consistently operate at this level, and many abstract problems challenge even sophisticated thinkers. Notice how different these stages are from Jung's symbolic stages, yet how both systems describe progressive development toward greater complexity and integration. For Piaget, development moves from the concrete to the abstract, from perception bound to logically rigorous, from egocentric to objective. For Jung, development moves from unconscious identity to conscious differentiation, and finally to conscious integration, from ego-bound to self-oriented, from fragmented to whole. Piaget's stages describe the construction of rationality. Jung's stages describe the achievement of meaning. Their different conceptions of the endpoint of development reveal their deepest philosophical divergence. For Piaget, formal operational thought represents mature cognition, the ability to reason logically and abstractly about any domain. There is no stage beyond this, no mystical transcendence of logic. Development is complete when the individual can think scientifically, coordinating theory and evidence, considering multiple variables systematically. It is not accidental that Piaget's description of formal operational thought closely matches the reasoning of the scientist in his laboratory. For Jung, individuation is never complete in the sense of finished. It is an asymptotic process, continually approaching but never fully reaching total integration. The self remains partly mysterious, the unconscious inexhaustible. Moreover, individuation does not necessarily lead to greater logical sophistication or scientific reasoning. Its goal is psychological wholeness, meaning, and authenticity. An individuated person might reason no better than before, but lives more genuinely, more connected to the depths of their own being and to the transpersonal patterns that give human life significance. Where Piaget celebrated the achievement of scientific rationality, Jung celebrated the integration of the rational and irrational, consciousness and unconscious, personal and collective. As you rest more deeply now, consider how each man would have responded to the other's central concerns. Imagine Jung examining Piaget's conservation experiments. He would likely acknowledge the cognitive developments Piaget describes, but would ask different questions. What symbolic meaning does the transformation of water from one vessel to another hold for the child? How does the child's developing sense of conservation relate to deeper archetypal themes of transformation and permanence. In alchemical symbolism, which Jung studied extensively, the transformation of substances in vessels was laden with spiritual significance, representing the transformation of the soul. Might not the child's gradual understanding of conservation parallel a deeper psychological recognition of identity persisting through change? Jung might suggest that Piaget, in focusing exclusively on logical operations, misses the symbolic dimension of the child's experience. The child who believes the taller glass contains more water is not merely demonstrating cognitive limitation, but perhaps expressing a symbolic truth that transformation changes essence, that form and content are united rather than separate. Of course, the child must eventually learn conservation to function effectively in the world. But something may be lost as well as gained in this development, a connection to symbolic, mythological consciousness that sees meaning in transformation rather than merely in variance beneath it. Jung might point out that young children have access to numinous experiences and symbolic depths that many adults have lost. Children's dreams often contain powerful archetypal imagery. Their play reveals mythological themes. As children develop logical thought, as they learn Piagetian operations, they often lose touch with this symbolic, imaginal dimension. Education and socialization train them to dismiss what cannot be logically justified. For Jung, this represented not pure development, but a necessary yet costly one-sided development. Individuation in the second half of life often involves recovering access to symbolic and mythological consciousness that was rejected during the ego's formation. Now imagine Piaget examining Jung's concept of individuation and the collective unconscious. He would likely be skeptical of the collective unconscious as anything more than a metaphor. How could patterns be inherited? If Jung means that certain cognitive structures are innate, then we can study them empirically. If he means something more mysterious, some literal inheritance of ancestral experience, then he strays beyond the boundaries of science. Piaget devoted his career to explaining how increasingly complex mental structures are constructed through individual experience and interaction with the environment. He would see no need to posit inherited archetypal patterns to explain human psychology. Regarding individuation, Piaget might acknowledge that adults continue to develop in various ways, but he would not frame this as symbolic journey or mystical process. Adult cognitive development, insofar as it occurs, involves applying formal operational thought to increasingly complex domains, perhaps developing post-formal dialectical thinking that recognizes the contextual nature of truth. But there is no need for shadow integration, anima encounters, or self-realization in Piaget's framework. These are poetic descriptions, not scientific concepts. Piaget would likely view Jung's emphasis on dreams and symbols as residues of pre-operational thinking, that intuitive, perception-bound thought of early childhood. The adult who takes dreams literally or sees profound meaning in synchronicities has regressed to an earlier, less sophisticated form of cognition. Magical thinking, animism, and the inability to distinguish subjective experience from objective reality to characterize the young child. And these should be overcome through development, not cultivated as sources of wisdom. Yet Piaget might pause when confronted with the universality of certain symbols and narratives across cultures. His own research emphasized universal patterns in cognitive development, finding that children in vastly different cultures pass through the same stages in the same sequence. Perhaps Jung's archetypes could be reformulated as universal cognitive schemas, patterns that inevitably emerge given the structure of human cognition and the common problems all humans face. Piaget might tolerate this version of Jung's theory, stripped of its mystical overtones and reinterpreted as universal cognitive structures rather than inherited psychological contents. Their different attitudes toward dreams exemplify their divergent approaches. For Jung, dreams were the primary avenue into the unconscious, messages from the depths of the psyche that often compensate for conscious one-sidedness. A person who identified too strongly with their professional persona might dream of being naked in public, a compensatory symbol highlighting what has been neglected. Dreams use the language of symbol and myth precisely because they originate in levels of the psyche that predate and transcend rational thought. To interpret dreams, one must understand not only the dreamer's personal associations, but also the archetypal patterns that give symbols their universal resonance. Jung developed an elaborate method of dream interpretation involving amplification, exploring the mythological and cultural parallels to dream symbols. A patient dreaming of a snake might be encouraged to explore not only their personal associations to snakes, but also the snake's symbolic significance in various mythologies and religious traditions. The snake as symbol of transformation, wisdom, danger, sexuality, healing, evil. These multiple meanings coexist in the unconscious, and the dream selects and emphasizes aspects relevant to the dreamer's current psychological situation. For Piaget, dreams were essentially cognitive play, the mind's way of assimilating experiences without the constraints of accommodation to external reality. During sleep, schemas can be exercised in a pure form, freed from the need to adapt to the actual world. Children's dreams are particularly undisciplined, reflecting the limited cognitive structures of early development. As children mature and develop more sophisticated cognitive abilities, their dreams should become more logical and reality-oriented. Dreams have no deep message or compensatory function. They are simply the cognitive system running in unconstrained mode. This difference in dream theory reflects their different understandings of the unconscious itself. Jung's unconscious is active, purposive, wise. It has its own intelligence, its own perspective on the personality that may be more comprehensive than the ego's limited view. The unconscious actively communicates with consciousness through dreams, fantasies, and slips, attempting to guide the personality toward wholeness. The relationship between conscious and unconscious is dialogical. Individuation requires the ego to listen to, engage with, and be influenced by the unconscious while maintaining its own integrity. Piaget had no comparable concept of an active unconscious. There are certainly cognitive processes that occur outside awareness, automatic schemas and operations that function without conscious attention. But these lack intentionality or purpose beyond their functional role. The young child who has not yet constructed object permanence is not repressing this concept or being kept from it by unconscious resistance. They simply have not yet built the necessary cognitive structure. Development proceeds through a gradual construction process, not through uncovering or integrating unconscious contents. Let us drift now into a closer examination of what each man said about childhood specifically. For here we find one of their most fascinating points of near contact. Both devoted enormous attention to childhood psychology, yet they saw such different things when they looked at children. Jung's interest in childhood was primarily retrospective. He worked with adults and sought to understand how childhood experiences and dynamics influenced their present psychological state. He was particularly interested in the child's relationship with the parental archetypes, not merely the personal parents, but the mythological mother and father that the actual parents constellated. The mother complex, for instance, involved not only experiences with one's actual mother, but the activation of the archetypal mother, that primordial image of nurturing, containing, and sometimes devouring feminine power. A person's psychology could be profoundly shaped by how this archetypal pattern manifested in their early life and how they related to it. Jung also recognized that children have their own psychological life, not merely preparation for adulthood. Children's dreams often display remarkable archetypal imagery, suggesting that they have direct access to the collective unconscious in ways that adults, with their more developed and defended egos, may lack. The child lives more fully in symbolic reality, where the line between inner and outer, subjective and objective, is more fluid. This gives childhood a certain psychological richness and authenticity that can be lost as the ego strengthens and rationality develops. Yet Jung also recognized childhood as a time of unconscious identity with the parents and environment. The child has not yet developed sufficient ego strength to differentiate clearly from the surrounding field. This original participation mystique, as Jung called it, borrowing from Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, is a state of unconscious identity with others, a lack of clear psychological boundaries. Development requires breaking this identity, establishing one's own ego and persona, even at the cost of losing the original unity with the world. The task of later life, in individuation, is to recover relationship with the collective dimensions of psyche, but now consciously rather than through unconscious identity. Piaget, in contrast, studied actual children in their present moment, observing how they interact with objects, solve problems, and explain their understanding. What fascinated him was the distinctive logic of childhood thought, the coherent but different ways children organize experience. The pre-operational child's animism, for instance, attributing life and intention to inanimate objects, is not mere ignorance or fantasy, but a logical consequence of their cognitive structures. They have not yet differentiated clearly between self and world, between psychological and physical causality. The sun follows them because they have not constructed the concept of independent physical motion. Their own movement and the sun's movement are undifferentiated. Piaget described the young child's thought as egocentric, not in the sense of selfish, but cognitively centered on their own perspective. The child cannot yet take another's point of view, cannot recognize that what they see and know is not automatically available to others. In his famous 3 mountains task, children were shown a model of 3 mountains and asked what a doll positioned at a different location would see. Young children typically describe their own view, unable to imagine a different perspective. This egocentrism gradually gives way to decentration, the ability to consider multiple perspectives and coordinate them into an objective understanding. Both Jung and Piaget saw development as requiring a kind of differentiation or separation, but they understood this process very differently. For Jung, it was primarily the differentiation of ego from unconscious, the establishment of conscious identity distinct from the collective psyche and the parental field. For Piaget, it was the differentiation of self from world, subject from object, and one's own perspective from other possible perspectives. Jung's differentiation was vertical, establishing consciousness above unconscious depths. Piaget's was horizontal, establishing the subject in proper relation to an objective world. Their different views of childhood language are particularly revealing. Piaget described children's egocentric speech, talking aloud to themselves or speaking in ways that do not genuinely communicate with others. He saw this as evidence of cognitive egocentrism, the inability to take the listener's perspective into account. As children develop, their speech becomes increasingly socialized and communicative, adapted to the needs and knowledge of the listener. This development in language parallels cognitive development more generally, moving from egocentric to objective, from assimilation-dominated to balanced between assimilation and accommodation. Jung would likely have interpreted children's private speech quite differently, seeing in it evidence of the child's dialogue with inner figures and psychological realities. Children often have imaginary companions, engage in elaborate fantasy play, and speak to themselves in ways that suggest complex inner lives. For Jung, this is not cognitive limitation but psychological richness, evidence of the child's natural connection to the collective unconscious and its archetypal inhabitants. The child who speaks to imaginary friends is engaging with autonomous complexes, partial personalities within the psyche that have their own voice and perspective. As Piaget's socialized speech develops, this capacity for inner dialogue may be lost or go underground, only to resurface in adulthood as the voice of the unconscious in dreams and active imagination. Their views on play display similar divergence. Piaget analyzed play as primarily assimilative, the child exercising schemas without the constraint of accommodating to external reality. Symbolic play, where a stick becomes a horse or a doll must be fed, allows the child to practice and consolidate their developing cognitive structures. Play becomes more sophisticated as cognitive development proceeds, evolving from sensory motor play in infancy through symbolic play in the pre-operational years to games with rules in middle childhood. Each form of play reflects and reinforces the cognitive capacities of that stage. Jung would see symbolic play as profoundly meaningful, not merely cognitive exercise, but the child's natural way of engaging with archetypal themes and working through psychological tensions. The child who repeatedly plays out scenes of nurturing and feeding is exploring the mother archetype. The child who enacts battles between heroes and monsters is engaging with the archetypal drama of ego versus shadow, consciousness versus the destructive aspects of the unconscious. Play is not mere practice, but the child's therapeutic activity, their natural way of processing experience and developing psychologically. This view aligns Jung more closely with later psychoanalytic thinkers like Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott than with Piaget's cognitive approach. As your body settles into even deeper rest, let us consider how each man understood the role of the social and cultural world in development. Both recognized that individual development occurs within a social and cultural context, yet they conceptualized this relationship quite differently. For Piaget, the social world provides the necessary context for cognitive development, but does not fundamentally determine its course. The child must interact with others to develop decentration, to overcome cognitive egocentrism by encountering perspectives different from their own. Peer interaction is particularly valuable because it occurs between equals, forcing genuine coordination of viewpoints rather than simple compliance with authority. Language, obviously social in origin, provides crucial tools for representation and thought. Yet the stages of cognitive development are universal, unfolding in the same sequence across cultures because they reflect the logic of constructive intelligence itself rather than culturally specific content. Piaget conducted his research primarily in Geneva with middle-class Swiss children, which later critics would point out as a significant limitation. When cross-cultural studies found variations in when children achieved certain stages, or whether they achieved formal operational thought at all, some questioned Piaget's universalist claims. Yet Piaget would argue that while cultural factors might accelerate or delay development, and while specific content varies culturally, the underlying structures and sequence of development are universal. All children must construct object permanence, must develop conservation, must progress from intuitive to operational thought, because these developments reflect the internal logic of intelligence adapting to reality. Jung's relationship to culture and society was more complex and more deeply embedded in his theory. The collective unconscious is precisely that dimension of psyche shaped by human cultural history, the deposit of ancestral experience. The archetypes are universal because they reflect fundamental human experiences and situations that have existed across cultures: mothers and fathers, birth and death, danger and safety, transformation and renewal. Yet how these archetypes manifest depends enormously on cultural context. The mother archetype appears as Demeter in Greek culture, as Kali in Hindu culture, as the Virgin Mary in Christian culture. These cultural expressions are not superficial but crucial to how individuals experience and relate to the archetype. Moreover, Jung saw modern Western culture as particularly problematic, having lost touch with the symbolic and mythological dimensions of experience. The rise of rationalism and scientific materialism, while achieving remarkable technological progress, left individuals cut off from the depths of the psyche. This cultural loss contributed to the neuroses and meaninglessness Jung saw in so many patients. Effective therapy required not just individual work, but cultural recovery, reconnecting with myth, symbol, and the transpersonal dimensions of experience that modern culture had dismissed as primitive or illusory. Jung's concept of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we reject or deny, has both individual and collective dimensions. Every culture has a collective shadow, traits and impulses, deemed unacceptable that are projected onto other groups. The Nazi phenomenon that Jung witnessed, the eruption of barbarism in the heart of civilized Europe, demonstrated for him the dangers of unconscious shadow projection on a cultural scale. Individual development cannot be separated from cultural psychological health. Both require acknowledging and integrating what has been denied or repressed. Their different relationships to religion reflect their broader differences regarding culture and meaning. Piaget, raised in a religious household, moved toward a secular, scientific worldview as he matured. He saw religious beliefs as belonging to earlier, more primitive stages of human thought, similar to children's animism and artificialism. The belief that natural phenomena are created by human-like agents. As humanity develops cognitively, as it achieves formal, operational, and scientific thinking, religious explanations should give way to naturalistic ones. Religion represents humanity's childhood, to be outgrown rather than integrated. Jung's relationship to religion was far more nuanced and positive. He saw religious symbols and practices as psychologically essential, providing connection to the numinous depths of the psyche. The dogmas and rituals of religion were, in Jung's view, refined over centuries to protect individuals and communities from direct, unmediated encounter with archetypal forces which could overwhelm the ego. The decline of traditional religion in modern culture was dangerous precisely because it left individuals without these protective structures and without symbolic means of relating to the collective unconscious. Yet Jung was not advocating a return to conventional belief. He distinguished carefully between believing in religious doctrines and having direct psychological experience of the realities those doctrines symbolically represent. His famous statement, "I don't believe, I know," was meant to convey that he had experienced the reality of the psyche, the numinous power of the archetypes. Not that he believed in supernatural entities in a literal sense. Religious symbols were psychologically true, pointing to real dimensions of human experience, even if they were not literally or historically true. This difference connects to their contrasting views on what constitutes healthy adult development. For Piaget, the mature adult thinks scientifically, coordinating theory and evidence, recognizing the constructed nature of knowledge while still affirming its validity within domains. The scientifically literate adult understands that knowledge is not absolute, but is the best current approximation based on available evidence, subject to revision with new data. This represents cognitive maturity, the culmination of development that began with the infant's simple reflexes. For Jung, the mature adult has individuated, integrated shadow and persona, anima and animus, and established conscious relationship with the self. They have recovered connection to the collective dimensions of psyche that were necessarily repressed during ego formation. They live authentically, guided by inner truth rather than collective conventions. They can hold the tension of opposites within themselves rather than projecting one side onto others. And they have found or created meaning that sustains them through life's inevitable suffering and confrontation with mortality. This represents psychological maturity, wholeness rather than perfection, integration of light and dark rather than triumph of rational consciousness. As we move deeper into the night together, let me guide you through a series of thought experiments, imaginative explorations of how Jung and Piaget might have approached the same phenomena, revealing their different interpretive lenses. Consider a 4-year-old child who insists that the moon follows them when they walk at night. Piaget would recognize this as an example of both animism and artificialism, combined with egocentric thought. The child attributes intention to the moon, assuming it moves to follow them, because they have not yet clearly differentiated psychological from physical causality. Everything moves the way they themselves move, with purpose and intention. Moreover, their cognitive egocentrism means they cannot yet understand that they see the moon from a particular, limited perspective, that the moon's apparent motion is a function of their viewpoint rather than the moon's intention. With development, the child will construct more adequate concepts of perspective and physical causality, and this endearing but false belief will be corrected. Jung would see in this same phenomenon something richer and more ambiguous. Yes, the child will eventually learn the astronomical facts, but is their original perception merely error? The child experiences a connection with the cosmos, a sense that the world responds to them, that they matter in the grand scheme. This is participation mystique, that original unity with the world that will be broken as ego consciousness develops. In some sense, the child is correct psychologically, even if incorrect physically. The moon does follow them, in that they project onto the moon a parental archetype, an attentive presence watching over them. This symbolic truth should not be dismissed as mere cognitive limitation. Furthermore, Jung might point out, in mythology and poetry across cultures, the moon is indeed associated with following, watching, constancy amidst change. The child taps into this archetypal pattern unconsciously. As they learn the astronomical facts, they should ideally integrate rather than simply replace this symbolic understanding. The mature adult can hold both levels simultaneously, knowing the moon is a rock orbiting Earth, while appreciating its symbolic resonance as watcher, measure of time, feminine principle, bridge between Earth and cosmos. Consider another example, a classic Piagetian task. A child is shown two equal balls of clay. One ball is then rolled into a long sausage shape. A pre-operational child typically says the sausage contains more clay because it is longer, failing to conserve quantity across transformation. Piaget would document this as revealing the child's inability to perform mental operations, like reversibility. They cannot mentally undo the transformation, and compensation. They cannot recognize that increased length is compensated by decreased thickness. Development involves constructing these operations, achieving conservation across multiple domains. Jung might ask what it means to the child that the substance has been transformed. Clay is malleable, responsive to shaping intention. The child witnesses creation as the ball becomes sausage through human action. Are they not expressing a truth about transformation, that change alters essence? In alchemy, which Jung studied as a projection of psychic process onto matter, the Vand transformation of substances was laden with meaning. The base metal becoming gold was not merely physical change, but symbolic death and rebirth, the transformation of the soul. The child, not yet fully rational, may be closer to this symbolic consciousness that recognizes transformation as meaningful alteration rather than surface change over invariant substance. Of course, Jung would acknowledge that the child must learn conservation to function practically. Measuring and quantifying require understanding invariance across transformation. But in learning this, something may be sacrificed. The recognition that transformation is powerful, meaningful, mysterious. The individuating adult must recover some of this capacity for symbolic perception while maintaining rational competence. They must hold both perspectives, that the substance is conserved and that transformation matters, that quantity remains constant, and that form and content interpenetrate. Consider how each would approach a child's nightmare, perhaps a common dream of being chased by a monster. Piaget would likely see this as cognitive assimilation without accommodation, the mind processing fears through symbolic representation. The monster represents whatever the child finds threatening, perhaps separation anxiety, perhaps aggressive impulses they themselves possess but have not integrated, though Piaget would not frame it in such psychodynamic terms. As the child's cognitive abilities develop, they should better distinguish fantasy from reality, and nightmares should decrease or at least be more easily dismissed upon waking. The dream has no deep message beyond reflecting the child's current cognitive and emotional state. Jung would analyze this dream much more extensively. What kind of monster appears? Its specific characteristics matter as they point to which archetypal pattern is constellated. A devouring monster might represent the negative mother archetype, threatening to engulf the emerging ego, an unconscious identity. A predatory animal might represent instinctual energies that consciousness fears and cannot yet integrate. The fact that the child is chased rather than chasing is significant, indicating the ego's relationship to this content as threatening rather than collaborative. Jung would want to know the child's associations, what the monster reminds them of, what was happening in their life when the dream occurred. He would also amplify the symbol, exploring mythological parallels. Heroes across cultures must confront monsters, and these confrontations represent the ego's necessary struggle with the unconscious. The monster is not merely what the child fears, but also contains energy and potential that must be faced and integrated. In successful development, the child eventually turns to face the monster, discovers it can be related to rather than merely fled from. This transformation in dream content parallels psychological development, the ego strengthening, sufficiently to engage with rather than flee from unconscious contents. Their different approaches to the same phenomena reveal how profoundly interpretive frameworks shape what we see. Piaget and Jung could observe the same child and generate completely different but internally coherent accounts of what was occurring. This is not relativism, as though any interpretation were equally valid. Each approach reveals certain aspects while necessarily obscuring others. Piaget's cognitive analysis illuminates the structures of thought, the logic of development. Jung's symbolic analysis illuminates the meaning dimension, the archetypal patterns structuring experience. The question is not which is correct, but what each reveals and what each misses. Let us turn now to their differing methodologies, for how one studies the psyche profoundly shapes what one discovers about it. Piaget was fundamentally an empiricist, grounding his theories in careful observation and experimentation. He developed standardized tasks, conservation of number, class inclusion, perspective taking, and observed how children of different ages approached these tasks. He was meticulous in documenting responses, looking for patterns that revealed underlying cognitive structures. His method aimed for objectivity, reproducibility, falsifiability, the hallmarks of scientific psychology. Yet Piaget was never a naive empiricist who thought facts spoke for themselves. He brought theoretical frameworks to his observations, constructivist assumptions about how knowledge is built, biological metaphors about adaptation and equilibration. His clinical interviews with children combined standardized tasks with flexible questioning, following the child's responses to explore their reasoning. This clinical method required skill and interpretive judgment, recognizing when a child's wrong answer revealed interesting cognitive structure rather than mere inattention or misunderstanding. Piaget published extensively, documenting his observations and theories in numerous books and articles. His writing was systematic, building arguments carefully, defending his interpretations against alternatives. He engaged with critics and revised his theories in response to new evidence, though he also staunchly defended his core insights. His style was academic, formal, constructing a scientific edifice that subsequent researchers could test, challenge, and extend. Jung's methodology was fundamentally hermeneutic, interpretive, seeking meaning rather than mechanism. His primary method was depth analysis with individual patients, extended therapeutic relationships that could last years. He would explore dreams, active imagination, and personal associations, gradually coming to understand each individual's unique psychology and how it related to archetypal patterns. This approach prioritized the particular over the general, the individual case over statistical norms. Each person's psyche was unique, though it contained universal elements. Jung also drew extensively on comparative studies of mythology, religion, alchemy, and cultural symbolism. His method of amplification, exploring the mythological and symbolic parallels to psychological phenomena, required immense erudition across cultures and historical periods. He would trace a symbol across different contexts to understand its archetypal core, the common pattern beneath cultural variations. This approach was humanities-based rather than scientific, more akin to literary or religious studies than to experimental psychology. Jung's writing style reflects his methodology. His works are often sprawling, discursive, following the organic unfolding of ideas rather than linear argument. He frequently uses case examples, sometimes extensively, allowing readers to see his interpretive process. He quotes extensively from alchemical texts, myths, religious documents, assuming readers will find their own meaning in these parallels. His style is evocative, sometimes poetic, inviting interpretation rather than demanding acceptance. Critics have charged that his work is unsystematic, contradictory, impossible to falsify. Defenders argue that his approach is appropriate to his subject matter. The psyche reveals itself through symbol and meaning, not through measurement and experimentation. These methodological differences reflect different assumptions about what the psyche is and how it can be known. Piaget treated mind as natural phenomenon, subject to scientific investigation like any other biological system. The cognitive structures he described were real in the sense that they had observable effects on behavior and could be systematically studied. While we cannot directly observe mental schemas, we can infer them from consistent patterns in how children approach various tasks. The scientific method, properly applied, can reveal the laws of cognitive development. Jung treated psyche as simultaneously natural and spiritual, objective and subjective, something that must be known from within as well as observed from without. The archetypes he described were real, but not in the same way physical objects are real. They are patterns of possibility, formal causes in the Aristotelian sense, that structure experience without being reducible to brain states or behavioral patterns. The collective unconscious cannot be directly observed or measured, but reveals itself through its manifestations in dreams, myths, and symbols. Understanding psyche requires participation, not just observation, empathy, and imagination, alongside critical analysis. Piaget would likely view Jung's method as insufficiently rigorous, too dependent on the analyst's subjective interpretation, too prone to confirmation bias. How can we know whether a symbol really means what Jung claims it means? Different analysts might interpret the same dream completely differently. Without systematic observation, controlled comparison, and quantifiable results, how can we distinguish insight from projection, discovery from invention? Piaget's commitment to empiricism stemmed from recognition that subjective interpretation is unreliable without external constraints. Jung would likely view Piaget's method as reductionistic, missing the essential meaning dimension of psychological experience. You can measure and quantify cognitive operations, but you thereby transform living psychological reality into abstract structure. The child performing conservation tasks is not just executing cognitive operations, but experiencing meaning, perhaps boredom at the repetitive tasks, perhaps pleasure at success, perhaps anxiety about being evaluated. These experiences are not epiphenomenal, but central to psychological life. Moreover, the most profound psychological realities, the encounter with the numinous, the sense of meaning or meaninglessness, the experience of wholeness or fragmentation, cannot be captured by experimental methods that require objectification and measurement. Their different relationships with patients or subjects also reveal their divergent approaches. Piaget's relationship with his child subjects was that of experimenter to participant. He designed tasks, observed responses, asked clarifying questions, but maintained appropriate distance. His own children, who served as subjects in his early research, were observed with scientific detachment, even as they were loved as children. This professional distance was not coldness, but recognition that scientific observation requires minimizing the observer's influence on the observed. Jung's relationship with his patients was intensely personal, a mutual engagement in exploring the psyche. Transference and countertransference, the emotional reactions between analyst and patient, were not obstacles to be minimized, but essential aspects of the work. The analyst's own psychology inevitably influences the therapeutic process, and this must be acknowledged and worked with rather than eliminated. Jung's famous statement that the analyst can only take a patient as far as the analyst has gone themselves reflects this recognition that psychological understanding is not merely objective knowledge, but personal transformation. This difference extends to how each understood the role of the theorist or therapist. Piaget was developing a scientific theory of cognitive development that should be true regardless of who conducts the research. Personal qualities matter for practical success. Patience and skill in interviewing children are valuable, but the theory itself should be impersonal, valid, independent of who proposes it. Scientific knowledge aims for this kind of objective universality. Jung was developing a psychological framework that required personal engagement and transformation to fully understand. One cannot truly grasp the reality of the collective unconscious, the power of the archetypes, without experiencing them. Analysis is not just acquiring knowledge, but undergoing transformation. Jung's insistence that training analysts must themselves undergo analysis reflects this understanding. Psychological knowledge is not merely intellectual, but experiential, not just about the psyche, but of and from the psyche. Let the gentle rhythm of these differences and similarities lull you further toward sleep as we explore the question of universality and cultural difference in their work. Both men claim to have discovered universal patterns, yet they understood universality quite differently. Piaget's universality was structural and functional. The stages of cognitive development unfold in the same sequence everywhere because they reflect the logic of intelligence adapting to reality. All children, regardless of culture, must construct object permanence, must overcome egocentrism, must develop logical operations. The content of thought varies culturally. Children in fishing villages think about boats and nets. Children in farming communities think about crops and seasons, but the structures of thought are universal. A 4-year-old child cannot conserve quantity whether they are in Geneva or New Guinea, not because they lack cultural knowledge, but because they have not yet constructed the cognitive operations that make conservation possible. This claim to universality made Piaget's theory both powerful and controversial. Cross-cultural studies have found variations in the timing of stage transitions and questioned whether all adults in all cultures achieve formal operational thought. Some researchers argued that Piaget's supposedly universal stages actually reflect Western-educated values, and that other cultures might prioritize and develop different cognitive abilities. Piaget responded that while environment influences the pace and content of development, the sequence and structure are universal because they reflect biological and logical necessities. Jung's universality operated at a different level. The archetypes are universal patterns, formal possibilities that structure human experience everywhere, but they manifest differently across cultures, shaped by cultural symbols and narratives. The mother archetype is universal, reflecting the fundamental human experience of being mothered and of mothers bearing children. But this archetype appears as Demeter in Greece, as Isis in Egypt, as the Virgin Mary in Christianity, as Kali in India. each culturally specific manifestation emphasizing different aspects of the archetypal pattern. The cultural variations are not superficial, but essential to how individuals experience and relate to the archetype. This made Jung's approach more compatible with cultural diversity while still claiming universality. He did not argue that all psyches develop through identical stages regardless of culture. Rather, he suggested that all cultures must address certain fundamental psychological tasks, birth and death, identity and community, meaning and chaos, and that all cultures develop symbolic systems for doing so. Individuation, the central process in Jungian psychology, takes different forms in different cultures, though the underlying pattern of differentiation and integration remains constant. Critics have accused Jung of imposing Western interpretations on non-Western symbols, of seeing Christian themes in Buddhist mandalas, or reading Greek myths into African folklore. The concept of the collective unconscious has been challenged as either empirically unfounded or better explained by cultural transmission than by psychological inheritance. Jung's extensive engagement with Eastern religions and his attempts to find universal patterns have been seen as both admirably broad-minded and problematically appropriative. Yet both Piaget and Jung were reacting against extreme cultural relativism, the view that psychological patterns are entirely culturally constructed with no underlying universals. Both believed they had discovered fundamental patterns that transcend cultural variation. Their different understandings of what is universal, cognitive structures for Piaget, archetypal patterns for Jung, reflect their different conceptions of what psyche fundamentally is. As you rest here, feeling the weight of your body supported, breath flowing naturally, let us consider what remains most valuable in each approach and how they might complement rather than contradict each other. For while Jung and Piaget rarely engage directly, and while their theories seem incompatible in fundamental ways, both illuminate aspects of human psychology that the other misses or minimizes. Piaget's great achievement was demonstrating that children are not merely ignorant adults lacking information, but rather think in qualitatively different ways. A pre-operational child who fails conservation is not stupid or careless. They are operating with different cognitive structures that make their answer logical given their current mental organization. This insight transformed education and developmental psychology, encouraging approaches that meet children where they are rather than simply transmitting adult knowledge. Piaget showed that intelligence is constructed through activity, that the mind builds understanding through engagement with the world. This constructivist insight remains foundational in cognitive psychology and educational theory. Moreover, Piaget's careful empirical work established patterns that any adequate theory must account for. Whatever else we believe about human development, we must explain why conservation develops when it does, why children can classify before they can seriate, why formal operations emerge in adolescence. His detailed observations provide constraints that prevent purely speculative theorizing. Any comprehensive theory of development must be able to account for the phenomena Piaget so carefully documented. Yet Piaget's approach, for all its rigor and insight, does seem to miss or minimize dimensions of human experience that Jung illuminated. The 4-year-old who believes the moon follows them is experiencing something more than cognitive limitation. They feel connected to the cosmos, addressed by the world, meaningful in the grand scheme. This experience of meaning, of being part of a larger whole, is not captured by discussing egocentric thought and deficient concepts of physical causality. When we reduce this rich experience to cognitive error, we lose something essential about what it is like to be a 4-year-old child, how the world appears to them in its numinous presence. Jung's great achievement was insisting on the reality and importance of the meaning dimension of human experience. People suffer not only from trauma or cognitive distortion, but from meaninglessness, from disconnection from the deeper sources of significance. The symbols and myths that appear in dreams and fantasies are not cognitive mistakes or primitive thinking, but the language through which the psyche addresses consciousness. Jung provided a framework for taking these experiences seriously, for recognizing that rationality and scientific thinking, while valuable, do not exhaust human psychological reality. Jung's emphasis on individuation as a lifelong process extending into old age and death corrects the tendency in developmental psychology to focus exclusively on childhood and adolescence, as though development ceases once formal operational thought is achieved. For Jung, the second half of life presents its own developmental tasks: integration of shadow and persona, confrontation with mortality, finding or creating meaning that sustains in the face of life's inevitable suffering. This expanded developmental vision remains relevant, perhaps increasingly so as populations age and people spend decades in the second half of life. Yet Jung's approach also has limitations. His method, dependent on personal interpretation and extensive erudition, makes his insights difficult to test or verify. Two Jungian analysts might interpret the same dream completely differently, with no clear way to adjudicate between them beyond personal conviction or clinical results. Jung's concepts, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, remain controversial and contested precisely because they resist empirical verification. His work reads more like wisdom literature than scientific psychology, profound and evocative, but frustratingly unsystematic. Is there a way to integrate their insights, to honor both the cognitive structures Piaget described and the symbolic patterns Jung explored? Some thinkers have attempted such synthesis. One might argue that Piaget describes how consciousness develops, how rational thought is constructed, while Jung describes the broader psyche, including unconscious dimensions that rational thought cannot fully capture or control. Development, in this integrated view, involves both the construction of increasingly sophisticated cognitive abilities and the gradual differentiation and eventual integration of conscious and unconscious dimensions of psyche. Or one might suggest that Piaget and Jung studied different aspects of the same developmental process. Piaget focused on how we come to know the objective world, how we construct concepts of objects, space, time, number, causality that correspond to external reality. This is one crucial dimension of development. Jung focused on how we come to know ourselves, how we differentiate from unconscious identity with parents and culture, establish individual identity, and eventually integrate what was rejected or denied. This is equally crucial. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient. From this perspective, a child simultaneously develops cognitive structures for understanding the external world and differentiates their ego from the unconscious. These processes interact but operate according to partly independent principles. The child who achieves object permanence, understanding that objects exist independently of perception, also gradually separates psychologically from the mother, establishing themselves as an independent being. But these are not simply the same process described in different languages. Cognitive development and ego development, while related, follow partly distinct paths. We might also consider that Piaget and Jung were addressing different questions arising from their different clinical experiences, Piaget wanted to understand how knowledge is constructed, how we come to have increasingly adequate concepts of reality. This question arose from his philosophical interests and his observation of children. Jung wanted to understand why adults suffer meaninglessness and neurosis despite external success, why rational understanding does not automatically bring psychological health. This question arose from his clinical work with patients whose lives appeared successful yet felt empty. These are both genuine questions, requiring different conceptual resources to address. Piaget's answer, that knowledge is constructed through adaptive interaction with reality, does not address Jung's question about meaning and psychological wholeness. Jung's answer, that meaning arises from conscious relationship with archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious, does not explain how children construct logical thought. Each provides what the other lacks. Piaget, the structures of cognition, Jung, the dimensions of meaning. Yet attempts at synthesis face real obstacles. Piaget and Jung operated with fundamentally different assumptions about what is most real and important in human psychology. Piaget was a naturalist who saw mind as biological adaptation. Jung was a romantic idealist who saw psyche as participating in transpersonal realities. Piaget was committed to scientific empiricism. Jung was committed to hermeneutic interpretation. Piaget saw development as progressive movement toward greater rationality. Jung saw development as cyclical return at a higher level to patterns that were originally unconscious. These are not easily reconciled. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that both perspectives remain valuable precisely because they are different. Human beings are simultaneously rational and symbolic, cognitive and emotional, individual and collective. We construct knowledge through adaptive interaction with reality, as Piaget showed, and we seek meaning through engagement with myth and symbol, as Jung showed. We need both perspectives, held in tension, each correcting the other's tendency toward one-sidedness. The danger of Piaget, without Jung, is a purely rationalist psychology that dismisses or pathologizes the symbolic, mythological dimensions of experience. If we accept only Piaget's framework, we risk seeing the 4-year-old's belief that the moon follows them as merely error, the adult's religious experience as regression, to primitive thought, the dream as meaningless cognitive play. We lose appreciation for dimensions of human experience that, while not rational, are nonetheless real and important. The danger of Jung without Piaget is a psychology that becomes untethered from empirical constraint, that explains too much through symbolic interpretation, that cannot clearly distinguish insight from projection. If we accept only Jung's framework, we risk seeing cognitive development as unimportant compared to symbolic individuation, dismissing the real achievements of rational thought, falling into mysticism that cannot be communicated or verified. Held together, they provide a richer picture. The child develops both cognitively and symbolically, constructing increasingly sophisticated concepts while also differentiating ego from unconscious. The adult benefits both from clear rational thought and from connection to the symbolic depths of psyche. Development involves both the construction of rational abilities and the achievement of psychological wholeness. Neither dimension can be reduced to the other. Both are essential aspects of being human. As the night deepens around you, as your breathing slows and consciousness drifts towards sleep, let us reflect on what their dialogue reveals about the nature of human consciousness itself. For in examining how Piaget and Jung understood development, we gain insight into consciousness as such, its structures and its depths, its rational achievements and its symbolic needs. Consciousness, in Piaget's view, is constructed achievement, the result of millions of small interactions between organism and environment, gradual coordination of schemes into increasingly powerful cognitive structures. There is nothing miraculous about it, though it is wonderful in its complexity and adaptiveness. Consciousness is what intelligence does. How biological organisms cope with and adapt to their environment when that environment is too complex and variable for instinct alone to handle. Human consciousness is the most flexible and powerful form of this adaptive capacity, able to represent reality symbolically, reason abstractly about possibilities, coordinate multiple perspectives into objective understanding. This view of consciousness is inherently optimistic and progressive. Through education and experience, through carefully designed environments that support development, we can help all children achieve their cognitive potential. There are no mysterious depths that resist rational understanding, no unconscious forces that might undermine or overwhelm consciousness. Problems in cognition arise from inadequate development or learning, and these can be addressed through appropriate educational interventions. Consciousness is sufficient unto itself, needing nothing beyond continued development and refinement. Consciousness, in Jung's view, is more problematic and mysterious. It emerges from unconscious depths and remains, always in relation to those depths, never fully independent or self-sufficient. Consciousness is like a small island in a vast ocean, dependent on the surrounding waters, even as it provides a necessary place to stand. The ego, the center of conscious identity, must differentiate from the unconscious to exist at all. Yet, it remains fundamentally related to and dependent on unconscious processes. Too much ego strength becomes inflation, identifying with archetypal powers beyond the ego's capacity. Too little becomes unconscious possession, swept away by forces one cannot recognize or resist. This view is more tragic, or at least more cautious. Consciousness is achievement, but also limitation. In becoming conscious, we necessarily repress or exclude other possibilities. The persona we develop to function in society conceals aspects of ourselves that become shadow. The rational consciousness that masters the objective world may lose touch with symbolic meaning and imagination. Every gain in consciousness involves corresponding loss, narrowing as well as focusing. The task is not simply to expand consciousness indefinitely, but to maintain right relationship between conscious and unconscious. To be conscious without identifying exclusively with consciousness. These different views of consciousness reflect different historical moments and cultural contexts. Piaget was heir to Enlightenment optimism about reason, confident that careful thought and empirical investigation could solve human problems. He lived through 2 world wars but remained committed to scientific rationality as humanity's best hope. Education, properly informed by psychological understanding of development, could prepare children for rational citizenship and scientific thinking. This was both description of how cognition develops and prescription for how society should nurture that development. Jung was more deeply shaken by the wars and by the psychological depths he encountered in himself and his patients. He witnessed supposedly rational, educated Germans fall into Nazi ideology, saw how easily consciousness could be overwhelmed by archetypal forces it did not recognize or understand. The First World War destroyed his faith in inevitable progress. The Second World War seemed to confirm his darkest fears about the collective shadow. Rationality alone could not save humanity if it remained unconscious of its own depths. If it projected its shadow onto others and acted out destructive archetypal patterns without recognition. Yet Jung was not simply pessimistic. Individuation, while difficult and never complete, was possible. Individuals could achieve greater consciousness and integration, could live more authentically and fully, and this individual psychological work had collective implications. If enough individuals confronted their shadows and achieved greater wholeness, perhaps collective consciousness could also develop. Jung's hope lay not in rational education alone, but in psychological transformation. Individuals undertaking the difficult work of integrating what had been repressed or denied. From our contemporary vantage point, we might see both thinkers as partly right and partly limited by their historical moment. Piaget's confidence in rational education seems naive, given persistent cognitive biases, given how often intelligent, educated people reason badly about emotionally charged topics. Yet his core insights about cognitive development remain valuable. His descriptions of how thought is constructed through adaptive activity. Jung's warnings about unconscious shadow and archetypal possession seem prescient given 20th century history and contemporary political polarization. Yet his concepts remain controversial and difficult to operationalize. His method too dependent on interpretive skill to become widely accessible. We might say that Piaget described the surface of consciousness, how it organizes and operates, while Jung described consciousness in relation to its depths, how it emerges from and remains connected to the unconscious. Both descriptions are necessary for adequate understanding. Consciousness has structure and development, as Piaget showed, and consciousness has depth and must maintain relationship with the unconscious, as Jung showed. Neither description captures the whole truth. Each reveals aspects that the other minimizes or misses. The question of whether development ends in adulthood or continues throughout life particularly reveals their different emphases. Piaget focused on childhood and adolescence because that is when the most dramatic cognitive transformations occur. By the time formal operational thought is achieved, cognitive structure is essentially complete. Adults apply these operations to increasingly complex domains, perhaps develop expertise in specific areas, but the fundamental structures remain stable. Development in the Piagetian sense is largely complete by late adolescence or early adulthood. Jung insisted that the most important development occurs in the second half of life, after ego formation is complete. The individuation process properly begins at midlife, when external achievements often prove unsatisfying and the question of meaning becomes urgent. The integration of shadow, the encounter with anima or animus, the gradual realization of the self, these processes unfold across decades of adult life. Development does not cease but transforms, becoming less about external adaptation and more about internal integration. The preparation for death, accepting mortality and finding meaning in finitude, is the final developmental task. Contemporary developmental psychology has increasingly recognized adult development, studying identity formation in emerging adulthood, generativity in middle age, integrity versus despair in old age. This expansion owes more to Jung and Erik Erikson, who was influenced by Jung, than to Piaget. Yet the question remains, how to conceptualize adult development. Is it primarily cognitive, developing more sophisticated reasoning about complex domains? Or is it primarily psychological and existential, integrating personality and finding meaning? The answer likely involves both dimensions, requiring insights from both Piaget and Jung. Their different relationships to death and mortality are particularly striking. Piaget, as far as I know, wrote little about death or how children understand mortality. This absence is telling. Death is not a cognitive problem in the same way as object permanence or conservation. One cannot interact with death, experiment with it, construct adequate concepts through repeated experience. Death stands outside the developmental framework Piaget constructed, a limit that cognitive operations cannot overcome. A child gradually constructs understanding that death is universal, irreversible, inevitable. But this intellectual understanding does not fundamentally alter death's reality. Jung was deeply concerned with death throughout his life and work. His childhood vision of God destroying the cathedral, his near-death experience in 1944 during which he had elaborate visions, his studies of afterlife beliefs across cultures, all reflect this ongoing engagement. Jung believed the psyche prepares for death just as it prepares for birth and all of life's transitions. The symbols that appear in the dreams of dying individuals often suggest transition rather than simple ending, crossing thresholds, journeys, transformations. Jung did not claim to know what happens after death, but he insisted that the psyche behaves as though death is a meaningful transition rather than mere extinction. This difference reflects their broader differences about consciousness and meaning. For Piaget, consciousness is epiphenomenal to biological process. Mind is what brain does. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. This is not tragic or problematic, merely fact. The meaning of life comes from the living, from relationships and accomplishments and experiences, not from any continuation beyond death. This naturalistic view is consistent with Piaget's biological and evolutionary framework. For Jung, consciousness participates in something that transcends individual biological existence. The collective unconscious is not located in individual brains, but is somehow transpersonal, shared. The self toward which individuation moves is not simply psychological structure, but has numinous, quasi-divine quality. Jung's language often slides between psychological and metaphysical registers, speaking of the self as both archetype within the psyche and as something more, perhaps synonymous with what religious traditions call God or Buddha nature. This ambiguity was partly deliberate. Jung wanted to avoid metaphysical claims while acknowledging that psychological experience points beyond itself. Their different attitudes toward religion and spirituality flow from these deeper differences. Piaget saw religious belief as cognitively immature, projection of human agency onto nature and cosmos, similar to the child's animism. Religious practices might have social value, providing community and moral education, but religious ontology, belief in supernatural beings or realms, cannot be sustained by mature, scientific thinking. Secularization is not loss but maturation, putting away childish things as humanity develops cognitively. Jung saw religious symbol and practice as psychologically essential, connecting individuals to the numinous depths of psyche. The decline of traditional religion was dangerous because it left individuals without symbolic resources for relating to the collective unconscious. Neurosis often resulted from loss of connection to these depths, and healing required recovering or creating meaningful symbolic frameworks. Yet Jung distinguished psychological reality from metaphysical claims. He did not insist that gods exist as supernatural entities, only that the psyche generates and responds to God images that have enormous psychological power and significance. This Jungian position is subtle and easily misunderstood. Jung was not reducing religion to mere psychology in a dismissive sense. He was arguing that psychological reality is real, that experiences of the numinous and encounters with archetypal forces are genuine phenomena requiring theoretical account. Whether gods exist metaphysically was, for Jung, unknowable and unnecessary to address. What matters is that the psyche experiences the divine, generates religious symbols spontaneously, and organizes itself around these numinous centers. In this sense, religion is psychologically true, regardless of its metaphysical status. From Piaget's perspective, this is having it both ways, claiming religious experiences are real and important, while avoiding substantive claims about what they are experiences of. Either gods exist or they don't. Either consciousness survives death or it doesn't. Poetic language about psychological reality and symbolic truth obscures rather than clarifies. Science has methods for determining truth claims, and religious claims have not survived scientific scrutiny. Granting them psychological importance while bracketing metaphysical questions is insufficiently rigorous. From Jung's perspective, Piaget's scientism misses what is most important. Not everything real can be captured by scientific method, meaning value, psychological significance cannot be measured or quantified, yet are central to human experience. The demand for precision and falsifiability, appropriate for studying cognitive operations, is inappropriate and reductionistic when applied to the symbolic depths of psyche. Different domains require different methods. Scientific empiricism is powerful but limited. This dispute about method and validity extends beyond psychology into broader cultural debates about knowledge and truth. The 20th century witnessed increasing specialization and fragmentation, different disciplines and approaches developing their own methods and standards. Piaget represents the scientific psychological approach, committed to empirical investigation and theoretical rigor. Jung represents the humanistic psychological approach, committed to interpretation and meaning. These two approaches have proven difficult to integrate, leading to persistent splits in psychology between scientific and humanistic wings, between those who study what can be measured and those who explore what seems most meaningful. Contemporary psychology has not resolved this tension. Cognitive psychology and neuroscience continue Piaget's scientific approach with ever more sophisticated methods, brain imaging, computational modeling, precise experimentation, depth psychology, narrative therapy. Existential approaches continue Jung's hermeneutic tradition, prioritizing meaning and interpretation over measurement and mechanism. Both exist, sometimes in dialogue, but often in separate institutional and intellectual spaces. The question remains whether synthesis is possible or whether we must accept a pluralistic psychology that contains fundamentally different approaches to fundamentally different questions. Let us consider, as you drift closer to sleep, what wisdom might be distilled from this long comparison. What do Jung and Piaget together reveal about human nature, consciousness, and development that neither captures alone? What guidance might their combined insights offer for living fully human lives in our complex world? First, both remind us that human beings develop, that we are not born complete but unfold across time according to patterns that are simultaneously universal and individual. Piaget shows us that cognitive development follows a reliable sequence. We cannot skip stages or teach children concepts they are not developmentally ready to construct. This counsels patience and appropriate expectation, meeting children where they are rather than where we wish them to be. Jung shows us that psychological development continues throughout life. The tasks of adulthood and old age are as important as childhood milestones. This counsels attention to ongoing growth rather than assuming development is complete once rational maturity is achieved. Second, both insist that development is active, something we do rather than something that happens to us. Piaget's child constructs knowledge through interaction with the world, not by passively receiving information. This validates experiential learning, discovery, allowing children to explore and make mistakes rather than simply transmitting correct answers. Jung's analysan must actively engage with unconscious contents, enter dialogue with dreams and symbols, undergo the difficult work of confronting shadow and integrating what has been repressed. This validates the necessity of effort in psychological growth. We cannot simply understand ourselves intellectually, but must actively transform. Third, both recognize that development involves loss as well as gain, sacrifice as well as achievement. Piaget's child who learns conservation loses something of the magic fluidity where transformation changes essence. The concrete operational child's thought becomes more logical, but also more constrained, less wildly imaginative than the pre-operational child's thought. Jung's individuating adult must sacrifice persona, identification, give up unconscious projections, face difficult truths about themselves, and relinquish comfortable fictions. Neither development nor individuation is pure progress, but involves necessary sacrifice, trading certain possibilities for others. Fourth, both point beyond individual development to species-wide patterns. Piaget's cognitive structures are universal because they reflect the logic of intelligence adapting to reality. Jung's archetypes are universal because they reflect fundamental human experiences and situations. Both thinkers sought patterns that transcend culture and individual variation. This search for universals has been criticized as imposing Western categories on diverse humanity, yet it also expresses profound democratic conviction that beneath cultural difference lies shared humanity. We develop differently in different contexts, but we all develop. Our psyches are structured by both unique experience and common patterns. Fifth, both struggled with the relationship between individual and society, between personal development and cultural context. Piaget emphasized universal cognitive development, but recognized that social interaction and cultural tools, especially language, are essential for development. Jung emphasized individual individuation, but recognized that individuals are embedded in collective psyche and culture. Personal psychology cannot be separated from cultural context. Both refused simple individualism, recognizing that to become ourselves through relation to others and immersion in cultural world, yet both also insisted on something irreducible in individual development and experience. Sixth, and perhaps most importantly, together they reveal the multidimensionality of human consciousness. We are rational beings who construct knowledge through logical operations, as Piaget showed, and we are symbolic beings who create and respond to myth and meaning, as Jung showed. We are biological organisms adapting to environment and spiritual beings seeking transcendence. We are children constructing object permanence and heroes journeying through archetypal landscapes. Neither description is complete. Both are necessary. Human consciousness cannot be captured by single framework or method, but requires multiple perspectives, each revealing aspects the others miss. This multidimensionality suggests that the goal should not be choosing between Piaget and Jung, but holding both perspectives, using each where appropriate. When we want to understand how children come to grasp mathematical concepts, Piaget's framework illuminates the gradual construction of numerical operations. When we want to understand why a successful adult feels empty and searches for meaning, Jung's framework illuminates the need for individuation and symbolic connection to the self. Different questions require different tools. The error lies in thinking one framework must explain everything. Yet this pluralistic conclusion, comfortable as it may be, risks avoiding the genuine tensions between Piaget and Jung. They were not describing entirely different phenomena that happened to both be real. They offered competing accounts of development itself, different visions of what is fundamental in human psychology. Piaget located development in the construction of increasingly adequate representations of objective reality. Jung located development in the achievement of meaning through integration of conscious and unconscious dimensions of psyche. These are not simply compatible approaches to different questions, but reflect different underlying ontologies, different views of what is ultimately real. The tension between their views might be framed as the eternal philosophical dispute between rationalism and romanticism, between Enlightenment confidence in reason and romantic validation of emotion and symbol, between scientific naturalism and spiritual idealism. This dispute cannot be resolved by clever synthesis because it reflects genuinely different intuitions about the nature of reality and consciousness. Some people resonate deeply with Piaget's scientific approach and find Jung's symbolic interpretations overblown. Others find Piaget's rationalism reductionistic and respond to Jung's depth and meaning. These different responses may reflect not only intellectual judgment, but temperament and experience. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that we need both approaches held in creative tension, neither dominating the other, each checking the other's excesses. Piaget without Jung risks rationalism that dismisses the symbolic and mythological dimensions of experience, that cannot account for religion, art, dreams, and meaning, except as errors or epiphenomena. Jung without Piaget risks mysticism untethered from empirical reality, interpretation that cannot be verified or falsified, psychological speculations that become unfalsifiable belief systems. Together, they represent complementary approaches to the profound mystery of human consciousness. As you lie here in the darkness, body relaxed, breath slow and gentle, mind drifting toward dreams, you embody the truth that both Piaget and Jung, in their different ways, sought to understand. You are a rational being whose consciousness is structured by cognitive operations built through years of interaction with reality. You are also a symbolic being whose psyche generates images and meanings that transcend rational explanation. Your dreams tonight will not be mere cognitive play, but mysterious communications from depths you do not control. Yet tomorrow you will wake and use logical thought to navigate your world, conserve quantities, coordinate perspectives, reason about possibilities. The child you once were constructed these capacities gradually, stage by stage, just as Piaget described, and the adult you are continues to develop psychologically, integrating rejected aspects of yourself, encountering archetypal patterns in relationships and crises, gradually approaching, if never fully achieving, wholeness, just as Jung described. Both processes are real, both descriptions true to dimensions of your experience. You need both cognitive rationality and symbolic meaning, both logical thought and connection to depths, In some sense, the conversation between Piaget and Jung that never quite happened historically can happen within each of us. We can honor both the construction of rational thought and the depths of symbolic psyche. We can appreciate both the child's gradual mastery of logical operations and their original numinous connection to the world. We can value both scientific rigor and interpretive sensitivity, both empirical verification and meaningful narrative. We can live as whole human beings who think clearly and dream deeply, who construct knowledge and seek meaning, who are both developing organisms and individuating souls. This integration is not easy or automatic. The tension between rational and symbolic, scientific and spiritual, cognitive and depth, psychological approaches continues to generate both creative dialogue and mutual dismissal. Contemporary psychology remains divided, unable to fully integrate these approaches. Perhaps this division is inevitable, reflecting genuine incommensurability between different ways of knowing. Or perhaps future thinkers will achieve synthesis that eludes us now, a framework that does justice to both cognitive structure and symbolic depth, both empirical verification and interpretive meaning. But even if theoretical integration remains elusive, practical integration is possible in how we live. We can educate children in ways that support cognitive development while also valuing imagination and symbolic play. We can pursue scientific understanding while remaining open to experiences that transcend rational explanation. We can think logically about practical problems while seeking meaning through myth, art, and spiritual practice. We can honor both Piaget's description of how we know and Jung's exploration of what makes knowledge meaningful. The story of Piaget and Jung, their parallel yet diverging paths through 20th century psychology, is ultimately a story about the richness and complexity of human consciousness. It reveals that no single framework, no matter how brilliant or comprehensive, can capture the full reality of what it means to be human. We are too multifaceted, too paradoxical, containing too many dimensions to be reduced to one description. We require multiple stories, multiple frameworks, multiple ways of understanding ourselves. Piaget offers one story, rigorous and empirically grounded, about how intelligence constructs knowledge. Jung offers another story, evocative and depth-oriented, about how psyche seeks wholeness and meaning. Both stories are true. Neither is complete. As you sink deeper into sleep, let these ideas settle gently into rest alongside you. You do not need to resolve the tension between Piaget and Jung, between cognitive structure and symbolic depth, between rational thought and meaningful narrative. You can hold both, appreciate both, live both. Your consciousness contains multitudes, structured by logical operations and animated by archetypal patterns, constructing knowledge and seeking meaning, developing cognitively and individuating psychologically. You are heir to both Piaget's scientific rationality and Jung's symbolic depth, both the child who gradually masters conservation and the hero who journeys through the night sea of the unconscious. Tomorrow when you wake, you will use the cognitive abilities Piaget mapped, thinking logically about your world, solving problems, coordinating perspectives, and throughout your life, perhaps especially in moments of crisis or transition, you will encounter the archetypal patterns Jung described, wrestling with shadow, seeking guidance from deeper wisdom, gradually approaching greater wholeness. Both processes are real, both essential to being fully human. The dialogue between Piaget and Jung continues in your own life, in the ongoing conversation between rational thought and symbolic meaning, between cognitive development and psychological individuation. between knowing and being. Let that dialogue lull you now into peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that human consciousness is vast enough to contain both perspectives, rich enough to require both frameworks, mysterious enough to exceed any final explanation. Rest now, wanderer, in the space between rational thought and symbolic dream, between Piaget's carefully observed structures and Jung's mythically imagined depths, between the child you were who learned to conserve quantity and the hero you are becoming who seeks the self. Sleep comes, and in sleep, dreams will arrive bearing messages from depths that cognition cannot fully explain, but that remain nonetheless real, nonetheless meaningful, nonetheless essential to your journey toward wholeness. The conversation between these two minds, Jung's and Piaget's, continues in you, in all of us, as we navigate between thinking and feeling, between logic and symbol, between the clear light of conscious rationality and the fertile darkness of the collective unconscious. Both illuminations are necessary. Both darknesses contain their own forms of wisdom. Hold them together as best you can, honor them both, and rest now in the mystery they together reveal about what it means to be a human consciousness developing across time toward we know not quite what end. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may you wake with both clearer thoughts and deeper meanings to guide your journey through the day to come.